We all know Constable. It is difficult to escape the haywain as it trundles from one biscuit tin to another, does the rounds of the chocolate boxes and tea caddies, and is caricatured on tea towels. Constable's name alone is enough to sell some products. You don't even have to look. But if we do look, and look instead at the real thing, we may find an artist more varied and more exciting than we imagined. Constable's father, Golding, was a prosperous Suffolk corn and coal merchant and farmer. In 1774, 2 years before the artist's birth, he moved with his family to an imposing brick mansion he had built in the village of East Bergholt. A few yards away down the street was the parish church that John Constable was later to paint and draw many times. But the heart of Golding Constable's business was at nearby Flatford on the River Stour. There he had his watermill for grinding corn and a dry dock for building the barges needed to transport grain down the canalised river for onward shipment to London. Returning barges brought back coal and other cargoes. At first, Constable worked in his father's business, but he became increasingly aware that he needed to deal in a different way with the rich landscape of the Stour Valley. He wanted to paint it. In 1799, he secured his parents' permission to study art and entered the Royal Academy schools in London. Constable is celebrated as a master of naturalism, but his ideas about how an artist might engage with nature changed over the years. In 1802, after 3 years' study in the Royal Academy schools and depressed by what he saw in that year's Academy show, he returned for the summer to East Bergholt, where, he told his village friend Dunthorne,
"I shall make some laborious studies from nature, and I shall endeavour to get a pure and unaffected representation of the scenes that may employ me. There is little or nothing in the exhibition worth looking up to. There is room enough for a natural painter. The great vice of the present day is bravura, an attempt at something beyond the truth."
The oil studies he made there were not artless, however. Constable had looked hard at Gainsborough, who painted in this part of the world 50 years earlier. Writing of the countryside around Ipswich in 1799, Constable said he fancied he saw Gainsborough in every hedge and hollow tree. Constable was equally devoted to the work of the 17th century master Claude, whose Hagar and the Angel was familiar to him through an early acquaintance with its owner, the collector and amateur artist Sir George Beaumont. He remembered Claude's picture when he painted this view of Dedham from the hills at Langham. Constable naturalized and modernized Claude, painting not an imaginary landscape, but the one in which he himself grew up. For the time being, at least, there was no room in this new vision for mythological figures. Remarkable though his 1802 studies were, they did not capture the light of nature or much of its colour. The oil sketching style that he developed around 1810 gave him a new way of getting at his material. A different way of looking and of painting produced, in effect, a different sort of nature, a livelier and more colourful one. Constable's rapid notation of the dog is typical of the beautiful economy of his oil sketching style. Half a dozen strokes for the dog, one for its shadow, and movement suggested by the slight disjuncture of the two. Studying the same subject again and again, Constable saw new things each time.
The world is wide. No 2 days are alike, nor even 2 hours. Neither were there ever 2 leaves of a tree alike since the creation of the world. And the genuine productions of art, like those of nature, are all distinct from each other.
These sketches were for his eyes only, though they were sometimes used as reference material for the larger, more finished pictures that he exhibited annually in London. Constable began exhibiting at the Royal Academy in 1802. For some years he prepared his pictures by the traditional method, working in the studio from drawings and studies. Dedham Vale Morning, shown in 1811, and his first major painting of his native scenery, was prepared in this way. The final composition combined elements from 5 different oil sketches and took a number of details from sketchbook drawings. By 1814, however, Constable had grown dissatisfied with this method. He decided to try to paint his exhibition pictures largely outdoors. Boat building, one of the first of these new works, shows us his father's dry dock at Flatford with a barge under construction. The eye follows the lines of the great wooden hull down to the river into which it will eventually be launched and on which another barge is seen passing. The ground is strewn with the tools of the boat builder's trade, but not much work is actually going on. Constable made some small pencil sketches on the spot that show many more figures around the barge. He seems to have had difficulty in realizing them on his canvas, and even painted out one figure, a man stirring the cauldron. The unfinished boat, framed by silvery clodion trees, has the early afternoon sunlight all to itself. Constable made the most of the very fine summers of 1814 and 1815 to work outdoors on several exhibition canvases. From East Bearcolt in 1815 he wrote to Maria Bicknell, whom he was soon to marry,
I have, my dearest love, little to tell you of what is passing here that can amuse you. I live almost wholly in the fields and see nobody but the harvest men.
The picture he was working on, the wheat field, contains many more figures than usual. He seems to have coped with the more prominent ones, the gleaners at the left, by adding them later in the studio from drawings. The dog was certainly based on an oil study which he had already used for an earlier picture, the Stour Valley and Dedham Village. This was painted the previous year and shows the same field. The men are digging out manure to be ploughed in for the sowing of the crop that we see being harvested in the wheat field. Gaining confidence, Constable began work in 1816 on the largest of his outdoor pictures, a 40 by 50-inch canvas of the view towards Flatford Mill from the footbridge. On the eve of marriage, he painted here a fond valediction to the scenes of his boyhood, the careless boyhood he said he had enjoyed on the banks of the Stour. Doubtless he too had sat astride the towing horses, fished from the bank, and hung about the lock. As if to point out the innocence of youth, Constable introduces in the field at the right the bent figure of a mower, shouldering his scythe like Father Time. The picture gave Constable more trouble than usual, and not only because of its size. After its first exhibition, he repainted parts of the trees and all of the sky. Full of beautifully observed detail, the work seems only just able to hold together the sheer amount of information it contains. John Constable and Maria Bicknell were married by their good friend the Reverend John Fisher at St Martin-in-the-Fields in October 1816. After honeymooning with the Fishers in Dorset, they settled in the Bloomsbury area of London, moving a couple of times before taking a spacious house in Charlotte Street in 1822. Constable went back to Suffolk comparatively rarely, usually on family business. In London, however, he continued to paint Suffolk subjects, only now on a much grander scale. The Haywain was one of a series of 6-foot canvases in which he attempted to match the achievements of the old masters he revered, the Poussins, Claude, and Rubens, whose Château d'Estaing he had also studied in Sir George Beaumont's collection. Working in the studio at several removes from the scenes he had originally studied, he fashioned yet another kind of naturalism. If the outdoor paintings he had made in Suffolk were brilliant representations of the detail of nature, those he now embarked on in London were designed to encompass her larger dimensions, those aspects of time and movement that the earlier and more placid canvases lacked. The greater freedom he now allowed to his imagination enabled him to invent pictorial structures that would better articulate these large canvases, drawing together the details in grand designs unified by the play of light. And in the Haywain he was able for the first time to create a convincing central episode or incident. The unfinished barge in boat building had sat awkwardly isolated in the landscape. Now, in the cart that makes its slow passage through the mill stream on its way to collect another load of hay from the distant meadow, he found a motif that unified the whole landscape. Working from the small oil sketches and drawings he had made in earlier years, Constable tried out and adjusted his ideas for these paintings in full-size 6-foot sketches, private working drafts that were nevertheless a new form of art in themselves. While working on his large canvases of Suffolk scenes, Constable did not give up painting from nature. New places entered his life, and he responded to them as directly as in earlier years. Hundreds of oil sketches and a number of finished pictures were made outdoors at Hampstead, where the Constables and their growing families spent part of most summers. From the Natural Observatory of Hampstead Heath, Constable made an especial study of skies, rapidly sketching their ever-changing forms. As Maria's health declined, sea air was prescribed, and the family went frequently to Brighton. There, Constable studied the boats and the bustling life of the beach. Constable's long association with the Fisher family took him also to Salisbury on several occasions. Staying with Archdeacon John Fisher and his wife, Constable painted the River Avon and the lawns and trees of the Close. The great spire of the cathedral was never far from sight. But of these places, it was Hampstead that played the largest part in Constable's life. In 1827, he and Maria and their 6 children, one more was to follow, moved there more permanently, taking a house in Well Walk. Part of the Charlotte Street house was let out, but Constable kept on his studio there. Announcing this new arrangement, he told John Fisher,
"I am 3 miles from door to door, can have a message in an hour, and I can get always away from idle callers, and above all see nature, and unite a town and country life."
Constable's series of 6-foot paintings of the River Stour reached its climax in The Leaping Horse in 1825. The sort of central figurative incident that he had developed in the hay wain was now an altogether more vigorous happening. Like a figure in some heroic battle piece, the boy jumps his horse over the barrier set up to prevent cattle straying. On the barge he is towing, a mother cradles her baby as she watches his attempt. The riders sometimes fell, while a curving willow tree behind him seems to add to his momentum. The kind of nature that Constable was now creating in his studio was a far more animated one than before. The suggestion of movement is made as much by the liveliness of the surface as by the chosen subject. By the later 1820s, Constable had exhausted his central core of Suffolk River subjects, at least as material for 6-foot paintings. He turned to a variety of other themes. Around the time of Maria's death in 1828, he looked out a tiny sketchbook he had kept in 1814, and from a pencil drawing of Hadley Castle, fashioned in this full-size sketch for a finished picture an appropriate image of decay and desolation.
I shall never feel again as I have felt. The face of the world is totally changed to me.
In 1829, the year after Maria's death, Constable embarked on what he called his book, a collection of mezzotints engraved under his close supervision by David Lucas. In this, he offered the public a retrospect of his work, but also another new model of nature, represented this time in terms of chiaroscuro, the interplay of light and dark. Between the extremes of black and white, Constable and Lucas discovered an infinity of subtle tonal gradations. Old subjects were transformed, Constable touching proof after proof to show Lucas what he wanted. Our sketches of his Suffolk years became, in mezzotint, the finished images he had never painted. The dramatic contrasts of light and dark created in some of the mezzotints, abrupt appearances of light, thunderclouds, conflicts of the elements, as Constable called them, were explored further in his last paintings. Like the hay wain, Salisbury Cathedral from the Meadows, exhibited in 1831, shows a cart fording water, but how different now is the mood. Thunderclouds rage round the cathedral, while a majestic rainbow seems to promise the passing of the storm. Constable's flickering touches of white suggest the moisture and fitful lighting of the scene. Constable's work in the 1830s was more diverse than we might think from this last great Salisbury picture. A project on his hands for 14 years, a depiction of the opening of Waterloo Bridge in 1817, reached its triumphant and colourful conclusion in 1832, on the largest canvas he had ever exhibited. Having started by more closely focusing on the figures of the Prince Regent and his entourage, waiting to board the royal barge, Constable, in his final version, took a wider and more distant view of the whole scene, framing the royal pageant with the natural splendour of trees, water and sky. Sketching in the quiet of his studio, he imagined views on the Stour that he had never seen, while, for a friend at Hampstead, he produced, in the year before his death, a painting of the heath that incorporated a windmill he had studied some years earlier at Brighton. Working up old themes, combining subjects, dreaming of the now impossibly distant landscape of his youth, Constable was, nevertheless, still willing to use fresh material. A new friend introduced him to the West Sussex countryside. At Arundel in 1835, he drew the subject of what was to be his very last painting, Arundel Mill and Castle. Constable was working on this shortly before he died, during the night of March the 31st and April the 1st, 1837. His death was unexpected, and C.R. Leslie, his friend and first biographer, was not surprised to see Constable's messenger at his door next morning. I ran down expecting one of Constable's amusing notes or a message from him, but the message was from his children and to tell me that he had died suddenly the night before. My wife and I were in Charlotte Street as soon as possible. I went up to his bedroom where he lay, looking as if in tranquil sleep, his watch, which his hand had so lately wound up, ticking on a table by his side, on which also lay a book he had been reading scarcely an hour before his death. He had died as he lived, surrounded by art, for the walls of the little attic were covered with engravings, and his feet nearly touched a print of the beautiful Moonlight by Rubens belonging to Mr. Rogers. Constable said of one of his predecessors, Richard Wilson, his works were truly original. He showed the world what existed in nature, but which it had never seen before. Constable himself did much more than this, revealing not only unsuspected aspects of the natural world, but creating different models of nature itself. Having set out in 1802 to be a natural painter who would passively record the scenes that employed him, Constable soon discovered the two-way character of his business. The face of nature changed according to its own laws, but also in response to the artist's state of mind. As the poet George Crabbe wrote in a couplet that Constable was fond of quoting, "It is the soul that sees, the outward eyes present the object, but the mind descries."